My guest today is Dr. Dara Horn. Dara is a multi-award winning author and a scholar of Hebrew and Yiddish literature. She has taught Jewish literature at Harvard University, Sarah Lawrence College, and Yeshiva University. In September, Dara released her latest book, People Love Dead Jews, Reports from a Haunted Present, which, in a series of essays, looks at how anti-Semitism has been viewed throughout history and questions why the world's dominant narrative of the Jewish people seems to focus on their deaths. The book has garnered much acclaim and has won a Natan Noble Book Award and a National Jewish Book Award. Dara, thank you for joining us. How are you doing?
Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Let me just start by saying, read the book. Uh, as I said before we started recording, I enjoyed it, and you said, well, maybe enjoy isn't the right word, and maybe it's not, but I certainly took something from it, and it made me think a lot. Um, Something I thought the book does really well and is really interesting is that it kind of goes across different time and space, and it's different parts of the world and different time. And one of the most fascinating chapters I thought was the chapter in Harbin, and which is a city in northeast China. And I thoroughly enjoyed this chapter because, like you, I've also been to Harbin, and I visited
Oh,
the
really?
yeah, I visited the city's old synagogue, and I was also shocked to discover that it was a concert hall. And also, like you, I attended a concert there and thought it was a very weird and surreal experience. What prompted you to go to Harbin?
Well, so i- so Harbin is most known in terms of like tourism for their ice festival. They have this massive ice festival every winter where they have, I think it's about 10,000 workers who build an entire city out of ice. And I'm a person who's traveled to a lot of different places, and I had heard about this, and it was sort of one of these places I was interested to visit. And I was sort of like, but is it worth going all the way to China just to see a city made of ice? And then I was like, what else is in Harbin? And I'm just looking at travel websites and things like that, and it's like ice festival, ice festival, ice festival, synagogue, synagogue, Jewish museum, ice festival, Jewish cemetery, synagogue, ice festival. And I'm like, that's weird. And I looked into this and I discovered that like there's this bizarre history where like this city in northeastern China was basically built by Jews. This is in the late 19th, early 20th century. The Russians got a concession from the Chinese to build a part of the like a branch of the Trans-Siberian Railroad into China. They needed to build a junction for this railroad. They basically needed to build a town. They needed experienced Russian-speaking entrepreneurs to build this town, and the only problem was like, who the heck wants to move to Manchuria? And at this point, the Russian government's like, "Hello, Jews. Would you like to live without anti-Semitic restrictions, but not have to be a bottom feeder in a New York City sweatshop? Here's an option. You could move to Manchuria." And 20,000 Russian Jews moved to Manchuria and built this city, really built all the infrastructure of the city. What then happens is in the 20th century, you have like successive regimes that make their lives more and more difficult until the last Jewish families evacuated by the Israeli government in 1962. So what's interesting in this story is not like, oh, here's a weird place where Jews used to live and don't anymore, because unfortunately that's extremely common throughout the world. What's interesting here is that the Chinese government in this province of China decided about, I think it's about 10 or 15 years ago now, to spend $30 million, 30 million US dollars, that equivalent, to restore Jewish heritage sites in Harbin. And what's really interesting about this is like they say the quiet part out loud, by which I mean they literally have like conferences and public events where they basically say, we've heard Jews have money and we would like some. And, like if we rebuild these Jewish heritage sites, Jewish tourists and investors will come and give us their magic Jewish money. So I was one of those Jewish tourists who came to
It
think to
worked,
check
clearly.
it out. Yeah, it totally worked for me. Exactly. But what I discovered was very, very, very strange.
Yeah. You visited two synagogues, the new synagogue and the old synagogue. What was that like, and what was the difference?
Oh my gosh, you're so up to date here. I'm impressed. So yeah, see that you fell for the scam as well. So well, I don't know if it's a scam, but there's there were these two historic synagogues in Harbin, and one had the one that's the old synagogue that, I mean, there's built about 10 years apart, but the old synagogue has now been turned into a concert hall, and the new synagogue has now been turned into a museum. So, and like, there's something weird about both of them, right? Because the museum is very interesting in that, it's sort of, it does the museum thing where they have, lots of photos and descriptions about this community, except it's basically just telling you, like, look at all these rich Jews who lived here. And it also, nowhere in this museum does it tell you why this wonderful community doesn't exist anymore. Not mentioned.
Mm.
And then there's also these like bizarre exhibits where they have like, like life-size plaster people posed with furniture. So I have like a life-size plaster man sitting at like a desk with a typewriter, and then there's a caption that says "Real Jewish businessman in Harbin." Right? I mean, it's sort of like this. I don't know. It's just very surreal. And so that's the Jewish Museum, and then there's this old synagogue, which is a concert hall. And I went to a concert there because that was the only way to get into the building. I bought a ticket for a concert, and it's very surreal because it is meticulously restored
Mm.
to look exactly as it did as a synagogue. And so you walk in and you're like, there's like, the Aron Kodesh, and there's like, they have, it says Da lifnei mi ata omed, like, know before whom you stand. It's like written above like the ark. There's like the bima, and there's the seats have like the little slot in the seat for like the siddur. But like you walk in and it's like Chinese musicians playing Tchaikovsky.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and like they put it in the piece. It's like, they go up to the bima, and instead of bowing before the ark, like they bow before me.
It's
Right?
completely bizarre, and you're sitting in the pews watching them where
Yeah,
you would
oh
normally
yeah,
pray.
yeah. I mean, I was sitting in the men's section because that's where my seat was.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's very, yes, it's very surreal. And in the book I talk about how it's like this muscle memory thing where I'm like, did I miss the Torah reading? Like, how late am
Yeah.
I? Right? It's like, your hand like goes to get the siddur, and it's like it's very, very surreal.
Yeah.
And what you feel is, and this is something I talk about throughout the book, is like, there's and this I write about it in the book, and also in I wrote recently a piece for the New York Times about this phenomenon of Jewish heritage sites
Mm.
around the world, which, as I say in the book, Jewish heritage sites, it's this brilliant marketing term, right? Because it sounds so much better than, I don't know, property seized from dead or expelled Jews, right? Like, who wants to go to that, right?
Not as catchy.
And yeah, and there's this feeling that I think, I and probably a lot of Jewish travelers get when you go to these places where, there was a Jewish community and now there isn't one, and now like whoever's there has restored some historic synagogue or whatever, and you feel really uncomfortable. At least I do. So I mean, but I now I've heard from a lot of readers that this is a familiar feeling. I feel really uncomfortable. And in the past, I always sort of like didn't understand why I felt uncomfortable. I always thought like, oh, I guess I'm, it's sad that this community doesn't exist anymore. Or like, oh, it's so poignant or something. But now I understand that there's actually that discomfort. It's not sadness, it's anger.
Mm.
But, as a Jewish traveler, like you're not allowed to express that.
Mm.
It's like you've buried it, and you've buried it so deeply that like you don't even realize that that's what it is. Like, you tell yourself that it's sorrow,
Yeah.
but it's actually rage.
It's also quite frustrating because I think there's supposed to be a sense that we're supposed to feel very grateful and happy that these things exist.
Yes, yes, right. You're supposed to like, bottomless gratitude to whoever
Right.
restored this synagogue for you, just like hoping that you would arrive someday. In the Harbin case too, there's the person there is one Jew who now lives in Harbin.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
yes. And he's and I've he actually is, and it's not just like guy living there, like he now is he's worked with the government to restore these Jewish heritage sites, and like he did an enormous amount of research to figure out exactly how the synagogue used to look, and he like tracked down all these families that used to live there and their descendants around the world. And I mean, it's a very sincere effort, right? But the problem is, for him, it's like it's China, right? So I mean, there's the government is kind of ultimately determining what you're allowed to say, what you're not allowed to say.
Yeah.
And so, it's sort of like, in my book, it's sort of like I'm presenting, this, I'm sort of exposing the cynicism of this effort. In a sense, he, as a person living there, kind of can't do that. Right. And so, but that's an example of like, there's actually a Jewish person doing this. Like, there are
Mm.
many places around the world where, there literally are no Jews. And, there's just local people who are working this out. I mean, look, I'm not saying that there's that these historical sites should be like, left to decay. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that there are better and worse ways to do this. There are places where this is done, by really sincere people with a lot of research and sensitivity and thought. And but there's better and worse ways of doing this. Is guess what I'm saying, and just identifying like these sites are capturing the triumph of evil.
Mm,
Because there's a reason that Jews don't live in these places anymore. Whether or not they tell you at the museum. You
right.
know, I mean, and literally, like, some of these places they're lying about, and they literally will tell you, like, oh, they all just decided to move to Israel. I'm like, yeah, and to leave all their assets behind,
Yeah.
right? They just decided to do that, right? So, like, some places they're openly lying. Some places they actually, it's, especially in Eastern Europe, I mean, it's no secret what happened. But, in all of these cases, it's about the triumph of evil, whether or not there's a mass grave involved. This is about a society that rejected the idea of difference.
Yeah.
Right? This
Yeah.
society made a decision that we're not gonna have people here who aren't exactly like us.
Right.
So, like, I mean, that is a story of the triumph of evil, and if you're not angry observing that, like, maybe you're not really observing it. Maybe there's something you're trying not to see.
Mm, mm. I could talk about Jews in China all day, but I want to talk about a different chapter which I thought was so gripping. It's you have a chapter on this man, Varian Fry, and this chapter takes place during the Holocaust, partly in America, partly in France. And this guy, Varian Fry, he was an American man who rescued approximately 2,000 people during the Holocaust, and the state of Israel honored him as one of the righteous among the nations. A lot of the people he rescued were famous artists whose work he enjoyed, which also raised questions as to maybe what some of his motives may have been. And our impression is that his rescue mission was this exciting adventure for him. But in many ways, Fry is portrayed as a bit of a tragic figure who is unable to lead a normal life after his mission, not to mention the fact that few, if any, of the people never really acknowledged him after. The people who he rescued, they didn't really acknowledge him. Why did you decide to write about him?
So, I actually that piece was an assignment from Tablet Magazine, which was it's an American Jewish magazine. That they, and they didn't tell me like what angle. They were just like, and this was a while ago. It was maybe about 5 or 10 years ago, and they were sort of like, oh, there was this American righteous Gentile. There's so few American righteous Gentiles, and like he's really, not very well known. Like, why don't you go write a piece about him? And like, I had never heard of him until they, suggested this to me. And and then I discovered, there's actually a filmmaker in Los Angeles, Pierre Sauvage, who's been working for many years on a documentary about him, and he's been doing this for so many years that he was able to interview a lot of people who were involved in this mission before they passed away, and and then also all of Varian Fry's papers are at Columbia University, and I live in New Jersey, close to New York City, so I was able to go to read through all of his crates of microfilm and whatever. So there was I did sort of this deep dive into this person, and you know what's interesting about it to me, and what I was sort of exploring with this is, I mean, first of all, yes, the interesting person, and sort of one of these people, like the more you dig into their life, the more you discover. He was a very troubled person, and what I thought was sort of interesting though is that like we have these sort of stories we like to tell about rescuers during the Holocaust, and those stories are often told in a kind of feel good way, and we're supposed to feel like this is so inspiring, like look, somebody's standing up to evil and whatever. And what I sort of realized in the process of like researching this person's life and their mission and all of that was that the thing about righteous Gentile stories is that they're actually the opposite of inspirational, because they show you what could have been.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you realize it's not like, oh, look how wonderful that this one person stood up to tyranny. It's kind of like, why didn't everybody become Denmark?
Mm,
Right? Like, if it was possible for this one person to do this, like, imagine if everybody had done this. You're sort of like, it sort of becomes this sort of obvious thing. And, and then you realize that, like, that everything, the way you've been learning about the Holocaust is like, it's treated as though it's like a natural disaster.
yeah.
It's sort of like that this sort of like, the Nazi onslaught, it's almost like it's a tsunami, and it's just like, what are we going to do in this horrible circumstance? Like we're not looking at like the motivations of people, and we're not looking at like, well, what was possible, what wasn't possible. And the thing about Varian Fry is that like he's an American, and so that was what was really interesting to me, is like, as an American Jew, I'm like, how come I haven't heard of this person?
Mm,
Right? Like that's, it's like, why haven't I already seen this movie? And that was interesting to me. And what I realized as I was sort of going through his, researching his life and his mission, is, first of all, this mission was originally created. It wasn't his idea. It was from something called American Friends of German Freedom. And it wasn't in support of Jews, right? It was in support of intellectuals and artists and writers and scientists. So it was basically like after, a lot of those people had fled Nazi Germany to Paris. And so then when the Nazis take over Paris, all those people flee to the south of France. And, basically what happened was like, the American government was sort of like, there's a fire sale on brains. Let's get a piece of that. And so initially it was from, support from the American government and his mission was basically to go to to Marseille and hand out visas to people who are on the State Department's lists of these are the people we want to save, which in itself is kind of this weird eugenics exercise, right? Which is hard to think about. But then what happened was the State Department ultimately ended up shutting down his mission.
Yeah.
Like they were the ones who authorized the mission. They're the ones who issued the visas. And then, about a year later, they shut it down because they realized it was interfering with their ability to cooperate with the quote unoccupied French government, which was actually collaborating with the Nazis. The State Department was one that made him leave France. They, his passport expired and they wouldn't let him, and they wouldn't refuse to renew it, and they made him come home. So, and then he had this sort of, and so what was interesting to me was sort of looking into this question of like, why, like the people that the State Department wanted to save, and how anguished he felt that he couldn't sort of, and he felt sort of like he wanted to save these brilliant intellectual people because he was sort of enamored with that world. But then what was interesting to me was to think about like, that's not the culture that was destroyed in the Holocaust, right? Like these like European intellectuals and writers and, in Western languages, like, it's like, he's saving these like French writers, but like, the culture that was actually destroyed was Yiddish writers.
Yeah.
Right? Like there wasn't like a rescue operation for Yiddish writers for the most part. I mean, and there were some things like that. I think I overstated in the book a little, but that was interesting to me was like it was this reveal of what people value. And then as you said, these were like these celebrity people. So like people like Marc Chagall, who he saved, or like Marcel Duchamp.
Yeah.
And what happened was then after he returns to the United States, he lives another 30 years. Or another, what is it? Yes, like, yeah, he dies another 20, he lives another 20 years, like a long time. These people wouldn't give him the time of day. He would try to be in touch with these people and they were just very dismissive of him. And what I realized is also, that there's this, for him, it was like, this was the time in his life when he mattered the most, like when he was contributing the most. And for all of these celebrities, this was the time in their life when they mattered the least, where they had the least agency. So like they didn't want to remember this moment, which was like, the worst time of their lives. He wanted to remember this moment, which was in a sense the best time of his life.
Yeah.
So, there was just this like difficult disconnect between it. And I wanted to add included this piece in the book because, I think that we use the stories of righteous Gentiles as a way of like complimenting ourselves, as sort of saying like, look at these wonderful people who stood up to the darkness. And it's like, I wanted to sort of dig deeper into that story and realize like what it really reveals about like failures of a lot of countries in the West during the Holocaust.
Yeah. It just makes me think, do you think Very and Fry ever sort of realized and internalized why they might not have gotten back to him and why they didn't want to talk about it?
I don't think so. I mean, and part of it is sort of, there's this weird thing where like part of it is celebrity vanity. Like these people were like hot shots and he's like a nobody. But what's amazing though is that he wasn't a nobody in Marseille. He was like, that one person even says that, there was one woman who was a relief worker there who was reflecting on this years later and said, she had known him in Marseille and then she met him like years later when he's like making cigarette commercials in America. And she was like, it was so weird. She's like, in Marseille, this guy was God and now he was nobody.
Yeah.
And it sort of was the opposite for these celebrities, right? And so like the question is like, did he ever internalize this? I don't think so, because I think that he still sort of kept telling himself that it was like, they're eccentric artists and, they don't answer their mail because they're, so busy being imaginative and eccentric. And I think he had, and he says that in letters and things like that. I did see him, I would see in personal correspondence, him making excuses for these people. And so I don't think he did. I think that he, he had these relationships with these people where he was saving their lives. But he also sort of thought of them like, that he was friends with these people and they did not feel that way about him. To him, To them, he was like, their hired help.
Yeah.
And you see that like so glaringly in the, in the correspondence between them. I mean, it's kind of horrible to read.
It's really heartbreaking. It's
Yes, yes.
it's very tragic. Um,
Yes, I'm very disappointed by it. I'm like, oh, come on, Hannah Arendt. Like,
yeah,
couldn't you have said something? Like, when Mary McCarthy was insulting this, oh, I met this guy right in front of a party and he's this madman and he's such a moron and whatever. I'm like, couldn't you have mentioned that, whether or not you like him personally, it was his organization that
yeah,
saved my life? She's like, no, nah. And that's a person who spent her whole life like writing about, totalitarianism.
yeah.
So I mean, it's just,
It's
yeah, it was really, I was very disappointed in a lot of these sort of civilizational luminaries, so to speak, and the way they responded to him. It was interesting. It was an interesting sort of character study, and
mm,
the way we like to think about agency and the way we rely or don't rely on other people.
absolutely. Um, you write a lot about the Holocaust during your book. It's people who love their Jews. You will. And at one point in your book, you write about your visit to an exhibition on Auschwitz at the Manhattan's Museum of Jewish Heritage. And while you praise the exhibition, you begin to wonder what it's all for, and you say that you know what the standard answers will be, that we must never forget the depths to which humanity can sink, and that those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. Um, you acknowledge this, but instead you posit that the reason for these sorts of exhibitions might be something else. You write, I quote, yes, everyone must learn about the Holocaust so as not to repeat it. But this has come to mean that anything short of the Holocaust is, well, not the Holocaust. The bar is rather high. What are you saying in this excerpt?
Well, so I do think that there has been this. I think, and I can't speak to the way this has worked out in the UK or in Europe, but in the United States there was this idea in the Jewish community about 30 years ago, or 30 or 40 years ago, that Holocaust education was going to prevent anti-Semitism. And that's it's about 30 years ago when you have this opening of this like massive Holocaust museum in Washington. You started having Holocaust mandatory curricula about the Holocaust in schools. You started having other Holocaust memorials opening around the United States. You started having Hollywood movies about this, and there really was, and a lot of that came from the Jewish community. And the idea was that people would go to these museums or learn about this in school. They'd learn where hatred can lead. They'd learn what the world did to the Jews, and they would then stop hating Jews, right? And like, it wasn't a ridiculous idea, but 30 years later, what's interesting is there's sort of much higher levels of anti-Semitism now, at least in the United States and probably many other places too, than there were 30 years ago. So it's sort of like, maybe we should reevaluate this. And what's come to mean is that Holocaust education, at least in the United States, is that's the only education people have about anti-Semitism. And so what that has come to mean is like, anti-Semitism consists of murdering 6 million Jews.
Mm,
And there's this problem where, as I say in that passage you quoted from the book, it's like the bar is kind of high. At that point I'm like, here's a bunch of things that aren't the Holocaust. And I list everything from like trolling Jews on social media to expelling entire Jewish communities from entire countries and seizing all their assets, which of course happened in many, many countries in the Islamic world in the 20th century. I was sort of like, all of those things are not the Holocaust. None of them are a big deal,
mm,
right? And the interesting piece of this is that a lot of the message in this book, in my book, is that people tell stories about dead Jews that make them feel better about themselves. And what's interesting to me is that, while I said 30 years ago, and at least in the United States, this was, this sort of move, this push for more Holocaust education absolutely was coming from the Jewish community. This exhibit, or exhibition, I guess is the right word. This exhibition that I was visiting, that I write about in the book, that in New York, this was not an exhibit that was created by the Jewish community. This was an exhibit. It was called Auschwitz Not Long Ago, Not Far Away. Yes, they made a Star Wars reference in the name of their Holocaust show. I'm just going to let that sit there. That show was created, it wasn't created by the Jewish community, it was created by a for-profit European company whose business is blockbuster museum shows. One of their most famous exhibits, the same company, was an exhibit about 10 or 15 years ago called Human Bodies. I don't know if I'm sure they had this in England. It was like, it was all over the United States. It was like a traveling show. I know it was in a lot of places in Europe as well. This was where they had like literally human cadavers
I read about
that they
this.
like, yeah, and they were like posed and like cross section. They dyed them different colors, and it was, as you can imagine, quite controversial. The same company, they also have another show that's about the Titanic. And as I put it in the book, I'm like, of course, this is not a disaster porn company.
Yeah.
It's an education company. Like, who's going to argue against education? I'm kind of here to argue against education because, when somebody is trolling you on social media and they're like photoshopping your face into a gas chamber, the problem is not that that person doesn't know about the Holocaust. Like, it's not an education problem. And I think that there's also this thing that we do, and I don't know if this happens elsewhere in other countries, but we have this ritual now in the United States where whenever some public person, like some public figure, says something vaguely anti-Semitic, they get dragged to the Holocaust Museum, and then they like have to make this statement that, like, Nazis are bad.
Mm.
I mean, the problem is like it's like, it's not really that hard to say that Nazis are bad. I mean, it's apparently harder than it should be, but like that's like, that's not a hard bar to clear. To be like,
Yeah.
oh, Nazis are bad, right? I mean, and also think about that's cost free, right? Like, you don't have to engage with actual living Jews, right? And so that's another piece of this story. People love dead Jews. And when I say that, people tell stories about dead Jews that make them feel better about themselves, one of those stories is Holocaust education, because you know, if you go to a museum to learn about the Holocaust, like, hopefully you feel sad about what happened, but you feel great about yourself because you're like, wow, I would never do this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, yeah, okay, you probably wouldn't, but like,
That's why you were dragged.
that's really not a hard standard to meet,
Yeah.
right? And then what it's come to mean is that, like, then it's like, when somebody like shoots up a synagogue, they're like, oh, only 3 people died, like, that it's not the Holocaust.
Mm.
Right? Like, or like, in the Texas hostage situation, it's like nobody died except the perpetrator. Like, we're great, it's amazing.
Yeah.
So I mean, yeah, this is kind of a bit of a problem with the standard.
Mm. Well, let's talk about that. Now, throughout your book, you discuss three different shootings. The shootings
Mhm.
are the Tree of Life, or La Simcha congregation in Pittsburgh, the Chabad of Poway shooting outside San Diego, and the JC Kosher Supermarket shooting in New Jersey, close to where you live. And you describe your reactions and emotions to each of these events. Um, I would be remiss if I didn't bring up the hostage attack in January, where a British Islamist gunman entered Congregation Beth Israel Synagogue in Colleyville, Texas, and held 3 Jewish congregants and their rabbi hostage for 11 hours, demanding the release of terrorist Aifa Siddiqui. You say in your book that after the Pittsburgh shooting, you were devastated. After the San Diego shooting, you were angry. And after the New Jersey shooting and the series of anti Semitic attacks that followed, you simply gave up. I'm wondering, what were you feeling after Colleyville?
I mean, at this point, it just becomes a parody of itself. Right? I mean, because the thing about the Colleyville attack is that, I mean, the whole Jewish community is like, waiting with bated breath after Shabbos, like being like, how's this going to end? You're like refreshing your newsfeed, you're panicked. I mean, we had, spontaneous, like, davening, like on Zoom with like 900 people. I mean, it was sort of like this, this enormous community response. While the rest of the world is like, watching football or something. And then what was amazing to me about that attack is that the day after that attack, the New York Times called me for a media interview about, of course, the big Jewish related news story of the weekend, which was apparently about Anne Frank.
Oh,
Literally.
I know what the story is. Yeah.
Oh my god, like, it's like I'm living in a parody. It's like,
Mm.
it's sort of, it's this like, it's like I entered it's like I've entered like the Matrix and I can't get out of the Matrix. And I feel like that's, I think a lot of Jews in the United States are feeling that way at this point. It's like, why are we stuck in this Matrix? So yeah, I mean, this was, devastating. And what I write about in the book, though, is sort of this realization. And so the thing about the Colleyville attack, what was sort of noticeable to me about that was you have this instant engagement with the broader public of what I call plausible deniability. right? So it's like any explanation that we can have for this that isn't that it's this anti-Semitic attack, we're going to go with that, right? And the FBI got a lot of flack for saying that at first. They did walk back that statement initially. They were like, "Oh, had nothing to do with the Jewish community." I'm like, it's kind of weird that they took a rabbi hostage in a synagogue during Shabbos, but like, yeah, I guess it had nothing to do with the Jewish community. I mean, the guy intended to hold up a pet store, but the security was too good at the pet store, right? So, but to be fair, the FBI did walk that back. But what I think was interesting was sort of there was a piece in the Times of Israel right after that where it was the reporter just walked around the neighborhood just talking to non-Jewish neighbors that were living near this shul, and they're all just they all were like completely convinced that this was this random attack that like could just have easily have happened at their church.
Mm.
They're like, well, like there are crazy people everywhere. And I'm like, okay, but like, I mean, this guy like got on a plane and it was sort of like this idea that you have to explain to people like that this is, there's sort of this mental gymnastics that people are doing to make this not about what it is. And that was familiar to me from what I do write about in the book. So that event obviously was too recent to be in my book. Although I did write about it for the Washington Post. The event that was, as you mentioned, the Jersey City attack, where, as I said, I simply gave up.
Mm.
The reason I gave up, as I put it, is because I realized that there was a way these attacks were being portrayed to the public.
Mm.
And what I noticed was, the attack in Jersey City was on a Hasidic community. This is a kosher grocery store. And I went and read every news article that was published about that attack and every news item about it. I almost couldn't find a news item that didn't say something derogatory about the community being attacked in the process of reporting the attack. Like in that case, all of them were like, oh, this Hasidic community was gentrifying a minority neighborhood. In which and there's so many reasons why that's absurd. I mean, these are not white hipsters, right? I mean, these are highly visible members of, the top hate crime target. I mean, it was so absurd, and then also like, is there this murderous rage against gentrification? Like, are people walking into cool coffee shops with automatic weapons and blowing away people with man buns? Like, I haven't seen that happening. So, but that's the plausible deniability, right? We're pretending this is about something it's not, right? And then also there's the victim blaming, which is exactly what that is, right? Like, oh, well, of course, like obviously there's a reason. Like basically what you're saying is that these people deserve it.
Mm.
Right? That's the message that's being sent, is that these people deserve it.
Mm.
And what's amazing to me about that is, that you see that with the attacks on the Hasidic community. I think it reveals the limits of the way we think about anti-bigotry in a pluralistic society. Because it's like, if it's people like at the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh, which is like a liberal synagogue, and it's like, oh, they're just like you and me. You shouldn't hate people who aren't in the same whatever group as you because they're just like you and me. They're just like everybody else. But like the minute they're not just like you and me, it's like apparently fine to like hack them with a machete.
Yeah.
Right. And so to me, that's the limit. And what I think is really interesting and it's very revealing, especially when you consider that people who are attacking the Hasidic community, they're not doing it because they disagree with Hasidic practice and belief,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, they're doing it because these people are visible, like that's all.
Yeah.
Like this guy like went into a random shul, like he went into it because it was a shul. Like there's a reason he didn't hold up the church down the street.
Yes.
Right. I mean,
Yes.
and that's like, and so like, I'm not, but like, yet we feel, what I see is in the public is this desire to engage this plausible deniability. Like, here's 8 reasons why you're not actually seeing what you're seeing. And it's this sort of this like mass gaslighting experience for the Jewish community.
Yeah, and you write how shortly after the New Jersey shooting, there was a spate of anti-Semitic attacks in the New York area, and you describe how one day shortly after the New Jersey shooting, while these anti-Semitic attacks happening, amidst you're on your phone, and amidst the chaos of your social media feed showing you images and videos of, on one hand, a march against anti-Semitism attended by 25,000 people, and on the other hand, a communal Talmud reading attended by 90,000 people, and the emotions that these evoke within you, it's just too much, and you seek refuge in Sefaria, which is an online library of Jewish texts, and you begin to learn the Talmud. What prompted you to start doing this, and why did this feel like such a safe place, if that's not incorrect to say?
Yeah, well, I appreciate that you say that it's a refuge, because that's what it is. It's not, because I've had readers who have said to me, they're like, your answer to like this rising anti-Semitism is to like go study the Talmud. Like, that's ridiculous. I'm like, no, it's not my answer. right? Like that's not the solution,
No.
right? But as you say, it's a refuge, right? So, yes, as you say, it was like this weird confluence of these. There was this this sort of Jewish community ran this anti-hate march in New York, and it was within a few days of Siyum Hashas. So that's the conclusion of the Talmud. It's for this program called Daf Yomi, which is this program of reading one page a day of the Talmud, and then completing your study of the Talmud in a very reasonable 7.5 years. So I just I was sort of just looking at these two gatherings, and I just thought, like, in a sense, like, which one would I rather, like, how would I rather spend my time?
Mm.
How would I rather spend my energy? And yeah, and I started studying, I started studying a page a day of Talmud, and yeah, I'm still doing it. This is now like 2 years later, so I haven't given up yet. I'm still doing a page a day, and what I found really amazing about it is that, like, in the Talmud, I discovered the same, like, fear and anxiety and grief that I was experiencing in my own life in response to this situation, because everybody in the Talmud is like living through this like post-traumatic stress,
Mm.
because so much of the Talmud is about the destruction of the temple, the destruction of Jerusalem, the exile, the two failed revolts against Rome, and basically it's like they spend like several hundred years getting over that, and not just getting over that, but sort of being like, how do we respond to this, this trauma?
Yeah.
And that's really what the whole Talmud is about. It's like this act of mourning for the destruction of the temple, and it really is an act of mourning. Like in the same, they're obsessing over, like, well, where were the different gates in the temple, like, what was the plumbing like it's that level of detail. And and at first I'm like, wow, these people were insane, but then I realize it's grief, right? In the same way, like, if someone close to you dies and you find like a movie ticket and you're like, this was the last movie we went to together, like, if they were alive you would have thrown it away,
Yeah.
right? But it becomes this sort of like, it's an act of mourning.
Yeah.
And so you sort of look at that act of mourning and you see them, sort of what they do, and you see what these people do over the course of a long time. And it's not like right after the destruction of the temple. I mean, it's like hundreds of years. You see what they do with this accumulated grief, also accumulated anxiety of feeling that lack of agency, of feeling this powerlessness
Mm.
after the failure of these revolts. And you see what they do with that, and what they do is sort of like, they do what I think psychologists would now call post-traumatic growth, where they don't move on from this disaster, but they move through it, and then they create something entirely new that is built upon the thing that they lost. And that to me was very moving, and there was so many sort of like little traits that, like, I always used to find annoying in previous experiences studying the Talmud, like how they're very like OCD about everything, and they're sort of nitpicking everything, and then I realized that it's an expression of that grief.
Mm.
That anxiety and grief are like both sort of, they're expressing this deep sense of loss and this desperate need to recover from it, and also to be resilient after it. And so that was sort of, suddenly that felt emotionally familiar to me.
Yeah.
As someone who's sort of, living in the American Jewish community, where, I mean, I can tell you, I grew up in the United States. Anti-Semitism played zero role in my life. Zero. I'm
Mm.
44 years old. I don't think that's true for my children. So, in a sense, I felt this emotional affinity with these
Yeah.
people in the Talmud who were sort of like, we used to have this great thing and now we kind of don't. And what do we do? Right. I mean, obviously, Lahavdil, very different situation. But that sort of like sudden, like, wait a minute, what's happening? That's not supposed to happen. And what do you do with that grief? That
Mm.
was, to me, felt like a refuge. And it was very comforting to me to see that this actually is something that, Jews have been dealing with for thousands of years.
Yeah, yeah. You actually write a lot about your children in this book, and in one chapter, it's very thought provoking and actually at times written quite comically. I thought we experienced this car ride with your 10-year-old son, where he begs you to let him listen to the audio play of Shakespeare's *The Merchant of Venice*, which is infamous for the leading character Shylock. He's a Jewish moneylender, and you take us through your reluctance and your anxieties about letting him listen to it before eventually relenting. And then in another car ride together, you put on the BBC radio production of the play. What made you want to include this car ride in the book?
Yes. Well, so this was sort of, yeah, just like one of these kind of stupid experiences that, I highly unrecommend listening to Merchant of Venice in the car with your 10-year-old son. It's not, don't do that. I did it so you don't have to. And so, yeah, for reasons that are not worth explaining, this ended up happening to me and my child. But I included this in the book because it's sort of, it was, what was interesting to me about it was realizing how much sort of I had internalized this sort of idea that we have throughout Western history about like what we're supposed to honor and what we're not supposed to honor. So basically, there's this elaborate apologetics around Shakespeare, and there's an elaborate apologetics about that play, that a lot of Jewish readers do,
Mm.
and a lot of Jewish scholars do. And and I read this play in school, and it was sort of like, the way it was taught was sort of like, oh, it's not really anti-Semitic, it's just a product of its time. And the proof is that it's so much better than, I don't know, Christopher Marlowe's The Jew of Malta, where the guy is walking around talking about how much he loves to poison wells. I'm like, okay, well, if that's the standard, sure, yeah, it's great. But again, like, the problem is like that's the standard.
Mm.
Right. And also sort of how we had sort of, and how much I had internalized that this like elaborate apologetics around that play. And what happened with listening to this in the car with my son was that it immediately became obvious, like, that this was just vicious.
Mm.
Right. And like, you can sort of turn yourself, I'm aware, as I say in the book, like, yeah, I have a PhD in literature. I'm aware that Shakespeare's plays have many nuances and many layers and mean many things, but like, of all the layers in this play, like, that's definitely one of them. Right?
Yeah.
And it was obvious to a 10-year-old. And like, I'm sitting in the car, like, and the other thing is like, just because the language is difficult, every 5 seconds I have to like pause it. He's like, what does this mean? And I'm like, the lines I'm parsing are like, certainly the Jew is the very devil incarnal. It's like, Mom, what does that mean? Right. And then it's like,
Yeah.
then you get to that monologue that's, the sort of, as I say in the book, like the part that makes it all okay, where it's like, oh, look, Shakespeare makes Shylock into this fully realized human character because he says, I am a Jew. Hath not a Jew eyes, hands, organs? If you prick us, do we not bleed? And I played this for my son, 10 years old. He's like, Mom, this is the evil supervillain monologue that every evil supervillain does in every Marvel movie.
Yeah.
Like, oh, you and me, we're the same, right? Like, I've had a rough life, and if you were me, you'd do the same thing, and that's why I want revenge, muhahaha. He's like, Mom, you're not supposed to fall for the evil supervillain monologue.
Yeah.
He's
Such
like,
an
what
astute
idiot?
observation.
Right, he's like, what idiot falls for the evil supervillain monologue? I'm like, I guess me? Yes, me. So, and you just realize like what you've internalized. And that's why I included it in the book, was because I sort of felt like I realized how I was part of the problem in a sense, right? Because you want, you sort of, you realize how much you have internalized that you don't even know. And that
Mm.
was, yeah, obvious to a 10-year-old.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, if people read and enjoy your book and they think I would still like more of this, they're in luck because you've also released a podcast which I've listened to
Yeah.
and I thought it was excellent. And you talk about a different set of stories. They're not in the book, and but the stories, in your own words, are a bit too weird for the book itself. What made you want to do a podcast on the theme of dead Jews, and how did you select the stories for the podcast in comparison for the ones in the book?
Well, so this again was not an idea that came from me. There was a Jewish magazine that wanted me. Actually, it's the same Jewish magazine. It was Tablet. That was like, they read the book and they're like, this would be great as a podcast. And it actually came, and it was from them and the publisher, because their idea was like, you should make a podcast version of this book. And then my publisher wasn't into that because they were like, they didn't want there to be a way of cannibalizing their book sales, I guess. And so they said, you have to do different stories. And luckily, the world's love for dead Jews is far too vast for one book to contain. There is no shortage of material. So what I sort of did was, stories that were too weird for the book. So some things that were kind of left on the cutting room floor. So for example, I have, as we already discussed in the book, I have this story about Harbin, the city in Manchuria, and the Jewish community there. What I didn't include in that piece is a story that I go into depth. I have an episode of my podcast about it, which is how when the Japanese took over Manchuria, they tried to create like a Jewish homeland in Manchuria.
Mm.
And it's this bizarre story where, they basically, 15 years earlier had encountered the protocols of the elders of Zion, and basically just took it as fact And instead of responding like, "Oh, these Jews are diabolically clever and they're going to take over the world," instead of responding with, "Oh, that's bad, let's kill them all," they were like, "That's great, we want them on our side."
Yeah.
You know? Like, maybe they can run Manchuria for us. Awesome. Like, let's create a slave state in Manchuria. So it makes this bizarre story that, like, yeah, I couldn't fit it into the book. Others were like, yeah, so a lot of them are sort of like the story behind the stories in the book. Um, like I have a story in the book about Diarna, which is this online project where they document Jewish sites in the Jewish historical sites in the Arab world. So very different from what we talked about earlier with Jewish historical sites. A lot of these are places where there's huge political instability. Tourists almost can't even go there from the West, and they have like sent photographers to document these, in a lot of cases, decaying synagogues and things like that. So what that interested, so in that, I have an episode where I sort of begin with Diarna, but then I go back into sort of like, well, what was Jewish life like in these, in the Islamic world, when it was like the center of the Jewish world. And so I go back into the story of the Cairo Geniza,
Mm.
and which is this like storage, basically a storage room in a Cairo synagogue where they didn't empty the storage closet for 900 years. And so it's like this, like, vast repository of documentation of the Jews of Egypt, and also really a lot of the Mediterranean region. And sort of it sort of opens up all these questions about literacy and the role of Jews as kind of this counterculture that sort of runs through, we think of it, in the West, but in the broader sense, not just, Christian lands, but Islamic lands as well. And sort of also sort of makes you aware of sort of the cyclical nature of a lot of what we think of as, Jewish flourishing, or and Jewish suffering. Because what was amazing to me is, people often will say to me, "Oh, in the United States, how can you even complain that there's any issue with anti-Semitism when you have Jewish Supreme Court justices and Jewish members of Congress and all these Jews and all these sort of, high places in the culture?" And I'm like, all of that was true in 12th century Egypt,
Mm.
right? And that's sort of, getting that kind of historical perspective is really sort of very, I think, comforting and interesting and useful as well. So, so in the podcast, I sort of go back into a lot of these, and then also try to dig deeper into the questions that I raise in the book
Mm.
about, like, what is it about the way we sort of want to think about anti-Semitism versus the way it actually is. And I explore that in many different contexts. In the podcast, sort of, yeah, expanding on the book, because it's a bottomless subject.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yes, it is. Yes. And as well as writing the book and doing the podcast, you're an acclaimed novelist and a scholar of Hebrew and Yiddish literature. And Yiddish is often viewed as a language of a cultured Jewish past, or in the present day, the language spoken strictly by Orthodox Haredi communities. Are you seeing a revival of Yiddish literature or culture outside of the Haredi community?
So, as a person with, I have a PhD in Yiddish. I often teach courses on Yiddish literature. This is something that comes up like every 10 years. There's like somebody who's like, "There's this revival of interest in Yiddish," and I'm like, yeah, that means that, like, there used to be 2 people in this PhD program, and now there are 4. Like, it doubled. Like, yay, we have double the number of people studying Yiddish literature at our university. But that's literally, I will tell you, that's literally what it is. It's like there were 2 PhD people and students, and now there are 4.
Yeah.
So, like, yeah, that's doubled. So yeah, I mean, okay, there's like different attitudes toward the language and this and that have changed over the years. I mean, yeah, there's a lot, there today is, it's, as you say, largely spoken in, Haredi communities. My interest in Yiddish is actually came as a just as a literature, because I was actually studying Hebrew literature, and then I sort of got involved with writers from a certain period who were writing in both languages, and I wanted to read their works in Yiddish, and that's why I learned Yiddish. It wasn't for like some, like I wanted to, learn about grandma's life or something.
Mm.
Um, so it wasn't, that wasn't the reason. So for me, it was sort of a scholarly endeavor. But what I think is amazing is, when you study Yiddish literature, you enter this world that you thought you knew and you don't. And that was sort of what's been revelatory to me, and that's something I try to bring to my readers in my teaching. And also, in this book, I also talk a little bit about Yiddish literature and things that make it different from literatures in non-Jewish languages.
Mm. I mean, if someone's listening to this and is like, why should I be listening to Yiddish things or reading Yiddish stories? What book are you going to recommend them to try and be like, no, this is actually quite good?
Yeah, so what would I recommend to people? I usually recommend if people really know nothing about Yiddish literature, the book I usually recommend they begin with is Sholem Aleicham's Cycle of Stories, Tevi the Dairyman. And the reason I recommend that is because it feels familiar to people because a lot of people have seen the musical Fiddler on the Roof. Fiddler on the Roof was based on those stories, but Fiddler on the Roof left out a lot. For example, one of the daughters kills herself. A lot of people, a lot of terrible things happen. Muttle drops dead. He marries Seidel, hooray, happy ending. Yeah, then 3 years later he drops dead. Golda dies. One of the daughters ends up in an emotionally abusive marriage. Chava is abandoned by her non-Jewish husband, returns to her family. Like, it's really different from the play.
Mm,
And the ways in which it's different from the play, I think, will sort of it really illustrates like the power of this literature. Because what I found is that we have this expectation in English language literature that we want stories to have this like narrative arc where they end with this um if maybe not necessarily a happy ending, but we have this expectation of there being like a redemptive ending. We want there to be like a moment of grace or an epiphany or something. And what I've realized is that even those terms are very Christian. And what I realized is like Yiddish literature almost never gives you any of those things.
mm,
Instead, the narrative arc is something really different. It's about endurance and resilience.
mm,
And what you see in the Tevye stories is Tevye is constantly like playing with these references to religious Jewish texts, but it's like he's in dialogue with these texts and he's arguing. He sees himself as a character in a divine drama. And he's sort of there's this sort of Book of Job element to it where he's like sort of railing against God but still is in relationship with God. So it's
mm,
like at no point is he like, well, maybe all these horrible things are happening to me because God doesn't exist. Like that doesn't come up. Instead, it's sort of like there has to be you to say, why did you do this to me? And the very last line of that book is something that would never appear on Broadway, which is Tevye says to the author Sholem Aleichem, please go tell all of our Jews everywhere that our old God still lives. So it ends up being sort of it's this kind of like amazing sort of theological meditation on really the nature of suffering, but also really the nature of resilience and the possibilities of resilience. And to me, I find that really really beautiful and very sort of true to human life.
mm. Now, as well as being a scholar of Yiddish, you're also a scholar in Hebrew. And if someone is looking to learn more about Jewish culture and Jewish history, but they can't really decide between Yiddish and Hebrew, what would you say? How would you help them decide?
I mean, I would definitely encourage people to learn Hebrew rather than Yiddish. I mean, my children are learning Hebrew; they're not learning Yiddish, because that's the language of the Jewish present and future.
Mm,
So for me, I mean, yes, Yiddish is an important component of Jewish history, but Hebrew is a much more important component of Jewish history,
mm,
and is a much more important component of the Jewish present. And I think that I actually honestly think that there would be sort of that Hebrew gives you an entrance point to so much of Jewish civilization from so many different angles, from like Israeli TV shows all the way to, of course, the Hebrew Bible. And I think that what's amazing is like when you know the language to sort of see how those things are layered on each other in a lot of like really interesting and sometimes paradoxical ways. And that to me is sort of word that to me Hebrew is really the key to understanding Jewish civilization.
yeah, yeah. Now, I want to thank you for doing this, Dara. Before we wrap up, tell the listeners where people can find you, what you've got going on.
Well, so unfortunately, I'm not great at using social media. So, I mean, I have accounts on social media, but I don't do much with them. I have a website, darahorn.com. There is a place to, contact me on that website. But in general, I mean, I have this, my book is People Love Dead Jews, Reports from a Haunted Present. The podcast is Adventures with Dead Jews. And I'm not too hard to find. I tend to write a lot for a lot of different publications in the United States, and I periodically do public speaking and things like that. So I'm generally not that hard to find.
All right. Dara Horn, thank you so much for joining Podcast Against Antisemitism.
Thanks for having me.